Hello everybody, it's Hater. Welcome back to another Destiny 2 build video. And in today's video, we are bringing back Stasis turrets for GM level Nightfalls by bringing it up to speed with the Void specific mods. With this build, we're going to be using the Nezarec Sin helmet combined with a Void weapon and volatile flow to make Stasis turrets just pop up out of thin air. So if you guys are into that kind of thing, show some support to the channel by giving the video a like, subscribing, and hitting the bell to be notified whenever a new build video comes out. Now that we got all that out of the way, let's get into the build. Starting things off, guys, where every build starts, we're going to be breaking down all the aspects and fragments we'll be using in the Stasis subclass. And the first aspect we're going to be using is the most obvious, the Bleak Watcher. The Bleak Watcher is going to allow us to convert our grenade into a Stasis turret. This is then going to shoot enemies with freezing bullets, slowing them, and then freezing them. This is going to be our main tool for the entire build. Laying this down is priority number 1. For priority number 2, it is going to be the other aspect we're pairing with this, Glacial Harvest. What this does is whenever we freeze enemies in general, it's going to create stasis shards around that frozen target. Those are then going to give us melee energy every time we pick them up. The main reason we are using this is to use the stasis shards as an extra resource with a mod that we'll be pairing with it later. But before we get into that, let's talk about the fragments we'll be using with this build. Starting from the left, we're going to be using Whisper of Fissures to increase the damage and size of the burst of stasis when we destroy a stasis crystal or defeat a frozen target. We're going to be using this so that when enemies are frozen and we have volatile rounds from our weapon, it's going to cause them to explode twice instead of once, dealing much more AoE damage. For the next fragment, we're going to be using Whisper of Conduction so that the stasis shards we create from Glacial Harvest will track to us when we're near them. On top of that, it is also going to boost our resilience and intellect stats. Moving on over to the next fragment we'll be pairing with this build, we're going to use Whisper of Chains so while we are near frozen targets or a friendly stasis crystal, we take reduced damage from targets overall and also gain 10+ recovery. This is going to be one of the nicest feeling fragments to use with this build because as long as we are near frozen targets from our turret or our super, we take reduced damage, boosting our overall survivability. For the fourth and final fragment we'll be using in this build, it's going to be Whisper of Torment. You gain grenade energy each time you take damage from enemies. Pretty self-explanatory. You take damage, you gain grenade energy back. Of course, for this final slot, it's not 100% set in stone to use just Torment. You could trade this out for something different. You could use something like Whisper of Bonds for super energy, or even Whisper of Rhyme to gain overshield every time you pick up those stasis shards. Depending on what you like to run, this spot is relatively flexible. Now that we're done talking about the subclass itself for the build, let's talk about the more important part of it, where we break down the different weapons for the loadout, the mods, and an inspect of my armor to give you guys an example of where everything can go. Starting off with the loadout itself, there are multiple different options that we can pair with Nezarec Sin. Nezarec Sin exotic perk, Abyssal Extractors, is going to give us ability energy for all of our abilities, including our super, whenever we get kills with something that is void damage. So something that we have to build around is void weapons in this build. Of course, the most popular void weapon that everyone is going to use is the Funnel Web SMG. Without a doubt, this is probably the best void weapon you can use, since you're going to get that volatile flow and have a very fast rapid fire SMG applying volatile rounds and doing a lot of damage. This is also going to be able to use the Artifact Overload Auto and SMG mod, making it worth using in GM content. But if we have to deal with something like anti-barriers, the Imperial Needle Bow or the Under Your Skin are definitely great options to swap out for. Then if you want to take it up another level and use your exotic slot, you could also pair this build with the Lemonarch Bow. With Lemonarch being able to apply the AoE poison damage from its exotic perk, and then combining that with volatile flow, you can create a pretty insane synergy with explosions left and right. Another weapon that I could mention here if you want to deal with unstoppable champions is the Graviton Lance exotic pulse rifle. Graviton Lance, in my opinion, is one of the best budget void weapons that you can pick up and use for your builds, because its exotic perk Black Hole is going to deal that high amount of damage, and then Cosmology is going to make enemies explode and then send out void projectiles that will make other enemies explode. Pairing this with Volatile Flow in your build and Nezarec Sin is going to really step up your game when you're trying to play on a budget. Something else that I do want to touch on, since it is brand new to this season, is the extra damage modifiers that are coming to the GM Nightfalls. Each GM Nightfall from this point onward is going to have a select burn. You're going to deal 25% more damage with that element at the cost of taking 50% more damage from the exact same thing. So for starters, in general, this build is going to be absolutely insane for the ones that are going to be void. But for the other ones that are going to involve solar damage and arc damage, we have to get a little creative. That's where in our heavy slot, we can pair 5 different exotics to absolutely melt through the bosses and champions. Starting off with arc damage, 2 exotics that we can use is the Wardcliff Coil or the Anarchy. Wardcliff Coil is going to be able to absolutely run down most champions inside of the Nightfall the moment they're stunned, and Anarchy is going to be able to do the lay it on them and forget about it kind of tactic and safely hit them from afar. Depending on what you want to do in that given scenario, both of them are going to get the exact same results. However, I feel like Wardcliff Coil is going to be much better in damage overall. For solar damage Nightfalls, both the Gjallarhorn and the Sleeper Simulant are the most obvious options. Both of them deal a super condensed high amount of damage, but the Gjallarhorn is capable of dealing with a lot of adds at the same time versus Sleeper Simulant, which can deal a high amount of single target damage. If you also want to experiment a little, you could use the Linear Fusion Rifle from the Vow of the Disciple raid. And finally, for Void Nightfalls, the Deathbringer Rocket is definitely going to be one of those heavy hitters. Not only is it going to be able to deal more damage, it's also able to use Volatile Flow and wipe out multiple packs of enemies at once. Of course, guys, use what you are comfortable with using in the GM Nightfall, because not everybody is going to have everything. The only thing I can do is recommend them to you. For the loadout that I ran during the birthplace of the Vile Nightfall, which has been playing in the background since the start of the video, I used the Extraordinary Rendition with Overflow and Frenzy, the Enigma Glaive with Grave Robber Frenzy, and the Deathbringer because the damage modifier for this activity was Void. Starting off over at my Nezarec Sin, I had this as Solar and I'm using the mod Elemental Charge. This is going to allow us to become charged with light whenever we pick up an elemental well, and if that well matches our subclass type, it's going to give us 2 stacks of charged with light instead of 1. I'll get into a little bit about why we're using this when we get over to my arms, but next to it, I'm using a rocket launcher ammo finder because I'm using the Deathbringer in my build. Now moving on over to my arms, I have them as Stasis, and this is where we're going to be using the mod Elemental Shards. Elemental Shards is going to make all of our Stasis shards count as elemental wells whenever we pick them up. Meaning that when we pair this with Elemental Charge, every time we pick up Stasis shards every 10 seconds, we're gaining 2 stacks of Charge with Light to spend as a resource. Later on, I'll talk about the spender when we get into the other pieces of armor. Next to it though, because we're in the birthplace of the Vile, I'm using Overload rounds with an Unstoppable Glaive. Moving on over to my chest piece, I have this as Void, and we're using the mod Reaping Wellmaker. We have to create Void Elemental Wells somehow, and this is the only one in the game that can do it when you're not on a Void subclass. It states, after activating your class ability, in this case it's our Rift, our next weapon final blow on a combatant is going to spawn that Void Elemental Well. This is going to be the main way we're getting Volatile Flow proccing in the entire build. Next to it though, I'm using 2 Void Resistance mods since I'm taking 50% more damage from Void damage in this Nightfall, And then because I'm using Artifice armor, I have a Thermoshock plating, so I take 25% reduced damage from Arc and Void. Moving on over to the boots. I'm using these as Void, and we're using our Spender, which is High Energy Fire. High Energy Fire is going to give us 25% more damage until we defeat a combatant consuming 1 stack of Charge with Light. Because of how abundant these stacks of Charge with Light are in this build, we're almost always going to have High Energy Fire procced for our weapons. Next to it though, because I'm using a glaive and a rocket launcher, I have both of the artifact scavenger mods for rocket launcher and glaive. Finally, moving on over to my class item, this is where my volatile flow is going to be. It states picking up a void elemental well is going to grant all of my void weapons volatile rounds, meaning every time that we pick up that void elemental well from Reaping Wellmaker, our Enigma Glaive and our Deathbringer are going to cause enemies to explode every time we hit them. And then next to it, I'm using Suppressing Glaive so that damaging enemies with my glaive will suppress them, preventing them from using their abilities for a short time, basically acting as a blinding effect. Once we have shield energy with the glaive, we can then apply this onto them because of the recent nerfs. And then finally, next to it, I'm using a bomber to reduce my grenade cooldown every time I use my rift. Overall though guys, that is going to be the build for today's video. Pretty much everything that I've talked about in this build can be changed out depending on what you need for the current Nightfall. Feel free to leave any questions down in the comment section and I'll get to them, but if you want to ask me in person, I also stream over at Twitch every single day. It'll be down in the description. Either way guys, I hope you all enjoyed the video. I'm going to catch you guys in the next one. Bye bye.